Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I have any extra time, I want to share it with the member from Montmagny, Lillette, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Member opposite from Scarborough just spoke to us, and he talked about the number of mothers in his riding who have been fundamentally affected by gun violence and other Canadians that have. He must be, I would have liked to have asked this question, but he must be bitterly disappointed in this bill that's come forward then, because it does never mention the word gangs, it never mentions the words criminal organization, it never comes up in the bill, and he's talking to us about how he wants to see those kinds of things impacted. He's not the only one on the Liberal side, I'm sure, that's disappointed with this bill, because the Liberal Rural Caucus has failed to protect their constituents one more time. And here we are again, Mr. Speaker, back talking about a government, about a Liberal-imposed gun registry again. Their commitment was to deal with guns and with gangs and violence and with illegal gun activity, and this bill does none of that, Mr. Speaker. Now, there's some familiar patterns that are taking place here. We've seen the Liberals over the last while play it easy. They want to take the easy way out. They take an initiative, and then when the pressure's on, they drop it. We've seen that with electoral reform. We saw it with tax hikes on small businesses, and we see them often making up phony stats to try to make things more palatable to Canadians. We also see them deliberately dividing Canadians in the hopes of getting some political gain. We've watched them try to isolate small groups and get some advantage for the Liberals from that. We've seen that in things like the carbon tax and just recently the summer jobs program. And again, they use selective or misleading information to try to create an opportunity to advance their issues. Another characteristic, of course, that we've watched from them is that they want to go easy on the laws that they don't want to actually enforce. We've seen that through bills such as the Aboriginal Transparency Act. We've seen it on immigration, where they ignore the rules and they won't enforce the rules as they're put in place. And we see it again, obviously, on the payment to Mr. Kedar, when they jumped ahead of the court and decided they wanted to make a payment because it would have made the Chrétien government look bad if they hadn't done that. But, Mr. Speaker, it looks like all those bad habits have come together in Bill C-71. They're trying to manipulate the Canadian public. They're trying to work PR angles on this with information that they know is untrue. They're using this to divide Canadians one more time. They're taking the easy way out by avoiding the real issues, which are gang violence and illegal gun activity, and they're doing what they said they wouldn't do, which is setting up the basics of a renewed long gun registry. Now, Mr. Speaker, the way this bill was introduced showed the Liberals are deliberately trying to set up legitimate firearms owners as the fall guys in this debate. Someone mentioned the Prime Minister's tweet a few minutes ago. From the press release of the bill is another example. Part of it declares that in Canada, restricted firearms are made up of handguns, certain rifles, and semi-automatics. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you know anything about firearms laws in Canada, but this is inaccurate. It's a complete fabrication about semi-autos. And this may be the goal of the government today, but that's not what the legislative reality is. And Canadian gun owners, firearms owners, need to be paying attention to this early misinformation. That's not the only misinformation, Mr. Speaker, that was presented. CBC, of all organizations, did an analysis of the stats used by the Liberals in their press release and their communications. The Liberals have focused on 2013, and CBC reports that 2013 saw Canada's lowest rate of criminal homicide in 50 years, the lowest rate of fatal shootings ever recorded by Stats Canada. Every year since 1966 has been worse than 2013. So the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, take a year when all the stats were lower than they've been for decades, then they use that to compare to today, and today is still below the 30-year average. And we just heard that a few minutes ago, one of the Liberals actually using those statistics again. The CBC report goes on. It talks about Canada's homicide rate in 2018 is similar or lower than it was in 2008. Or 1998, it's well below 1988 and 1978. It's similar to what it was in 1968, and the rate today is very close to 1928, Mr. Speaker. And so they go on and they say, if one were to ask how 2016 compared with a decade before, one would find the rate of firearms homicides remained boringly unchanged, including the rate of homicides with handguns. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that you've been taken with that article and I've read it through, I'm sure, as well. But their conclusion is that none of this constitutes, as they call it, a steady increase. And they say this is what a statistician might reasonably call a steady decrease. So, Mr. Speaker, it's not accurate to say that offences involving firearms have become more prevalent, especially since 2013. That's not the only place where they've been misleading Canadians, Mr. Speaker. The second media report, and again, this was the CBC after their government briefing, I assume, that stated, and I quote, police will be able to determine who exactly was the last licensed owner to purchase a particular gun. Now, if the government has the capacity to track the last legitimate owner of every firearm in Canada, That actually accomplishes the goals of a long gun, of a firearms registry. So, Mr. Speaker, are they setting up a gun registry or are they not? Mr. Speaker, they have given up on gangs and they are ganging up on Canadians. And in this process, they need to distort the facts so they know that Canadians won't accept that. The bill itself is a lot of nothing, and what is there, for the most part, is targeting legitimate gun owners and business people, as it lays the foundation for a new registry. Again, the CBC article says every firearm will be tied to its owner. That's not possible in this government unless this government takes this new reference number system that they're using, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, to track individuals and their firearms. People need to be paying attention to this. This is the foundation for establishing a registry. Lays out the components of a registry. There's a front door registry by returning all the data to Quebec. I think Canadians need to also ask, is there any other data that exists? Because in the legislation it says that the changes that we made will be designated to have never existed. So if there's other data that exists, are the Liberal governments going to be able to bring that back and use that across this country? We need to know that, and some people better start taking a closer look at this. It sets up a backdoor registry, Mr. Speaker. In the past, we've had to, if you purchase a firearm, you've had to verify that the other person has a license. Businesses have put that number on file, and everyone I've ever dealt with has done that. Adding these new requirements, the reference number, the serial number, the buyer, and a 20-year hold allows for the establishment of a gun registry. The reference number for private transactions is even more interesting because it actually makes no sense. It won't be one single bit effective unless it's the first step in requiring the private registration of firearms. Again, a registry. And this needs to be understood. It has a pile of consequences. It has consequences towards invasion of privacy, the question of the financing of the registrar, and the entire reference implementation and how they're putting it together. Mr. Speaker, I talked to a friend of mine who's been involved in this for a while, and he said this new setup is going to require hundreds of employees in order to be able to handle these reference numbers that are being sent in. I'd like to know what the budget is. Is it perhaps $2 million like the last one was? And what number will that grow to, Mr. Speaker? We need to know that quickly. Provision on background checks that requires examination of extended time periods on application process is okay, but is it really effective? Because those background checks are already very thorough. So, Mr. Speaker, I think I've got a couple minutes left. I just want to wrap up by saying this bill divides Canadians on bad assumptions. The manipulated data makes it look like there's a growing problem when there isn't one. The legislation targets only legitimate firearms owners and marks them. These guys have avoided the hard work. The gang issues are hard to deal with. Regular Canadians are a lot easier to beat on. And so, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have come forward with a phony piece of legislation, sets the groundwork for a front and backdoor registry. It uses deliberately distorted statistics to try to scare people, and it will cost what? None of us know that, Mr. Speaker. It will make it more expensive and inconvenient for honest people. It will lay the groundwork for both a registry in Quebec and a foundation for registry across this country, and it picks out the legitimate firearm owners and does not deal with the problem that the Liberals claimed that they were trying to address.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for St. Catharines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for his comments. I asked the honourable member behind him a question. I'll get to the same one in a second. He talks a lot about misinformation, and of course we can't accuse the Conservatives of blowing things way out of proportion.
We would never.
That would never happen. That's not something that we would do. However, from a Belleville newspaper, the newspaper reporter spoke to Ben Harvey, who's a gun store owner, and says there's a lot of moving parts in the proposed bill, but there's not been a real big change on the actual aspect of logging the customer's information and keeping a record on what they've purchased. We already do it with ammunition, and now they're just asking us to do it with guns. By doing it with guns, we're going to give the police and the community the tool to begin to track where guns are purchased, how they're being trafficked, and how they're being used, and that's not a bad thing.
Wow.
So it seems Ben from Belleville, who owns a gun shop, thinks this is a public safety legislation. This is a good step forward. This is common sense gun control. Why are the Conservatives engaging in misleading leading Canadians on this issue?
The honourable member from Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the Liberals aren't actually dealing with the issue that they claimed that they were going to address, which was gang violence and illegal gun activity. And we know that the majority of that problem comes from smuggled guns. It comes from firearms that have been stolen. This has nothing to do with that. And it's actually interesting, even his question, he seems to be implying that they are going to be establishing a gun registry, and that is an important thing for them to do. So Canadians across the country need to be paying attention to the questions that they're asking. They need to be paying attention to these reference numbers that are going to be required for every single firearm transaction, so that we can understand, are the Liberals setting up a gun registry as they promised they wouldn't? Or what is it that they're doing over there?
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member, l'honorable député de Montmagny.
The honourable member from Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that I won't have a chance to speak, I'd like to ask a question. When tabling the bill, the minister said it would take 3 to 5 minutes for a gun owner to call and get an almost instantaneous answer from officials to be authorized to travel with their firearm. We know that the Canada Revenue Agency, well, you need at least 45 minutes to get an answer on the phone. I'm going to ask my colleague, what does he think about this? Knowing full well that it's not on the weekend. As my colleague said, people travel, there's activities, there are things happening all throughout Canada. There's shows and all types of events. People won't be able to get answers from officials on the weekends. I think they're dreaming with this idea. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
This business for a long while, and he said actually right now you can't get a response on the weekends. It's impossible to get a response. So now this government is coming telling us that every gun show across the country, every place that people go, that they might be exchanging or buying firearms or whatever, they're going to have to call in and get a reference number, but there's nobody working. So as I mentioned earlier, someone who's been involved in this for a long time with the other gun registry said this is going to require the hiring of hundreds of people in order to make this work. It's not going to be instantaneous. The authorization to transport typically took 2 to 3 days. And so if that's the case, it's going to destroy the gun shows that so many people depend on across this country. And I need to say, I'm very sorry that my colleague probably won't get his time today because of the time allocation motion that the Liberals have bought in on C-71. We're very sad to see the fact that our members are being muzzled because they don't want to have a discussion about these issues.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the member across the way talks about being muzzled. You know, it's just the other day, full day. Imagine the government brings in this bill, C-71, wants to have the debate. One speaker from the Conservative Party addresses the bill and then actually adjourns debate. Wow. So there should be no surprise that the debate ended that day when you had a Conservative member adjourning debate. Now, if they want to play the games and so forth, this legislation is all about public safety for Canadians. It is a commitment that's being fulfilled by this government that was made to Canadians in the last election. Even the NRA supports parts of this bill in which the Conservatives are opposing. No one is saying that this is about the long gun registry. Nobody, Mr. Speaker. It's not about that. But no matter how many times we say it, the Conservatives just want to twist it into something it is not. My question to the member across the way is, would he not concede that maybe the NRA's position on it, in terms of having the retailers record the information, is a responsible approach? Why is the Conservatives even further right than organizations like the NRA?
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
I think the NRA operates in the United States, Mr. Speaker. But anyway, as the gentleman across the way is talking about the long gun registry, of course he doesn't want to talk about the long gun registry. It cost them an awful lot in the past parliaments. It's going to cost them again in the next election. He doesn't want the discussion to be about whether they're establishing a registry or not. The reality is they are not keeping their promises. This bill is not about public safety. This bill is about some sort of public relations campaign where they're targeting legitimate firearms owners because they don't want to deal with gang violence. They don't want to deal with illegal gun activity, and so they've chosen to avoid it one more time.